Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to a special joint webinar co-hosted by the Review of Political Economy and the International Journal of Political Economy. The webinar today is the result of conversations that Mario Seccareccia and I had back in April of 2020. We we figured that as journal editors, we had a responsibility to have something to say about this crisis, and we decided to publish not one but two symposiums, one in each of our respected journals. In December of 2020, Mario published in the International Journal of Political Economy a symposium on the question where I was guest editor. And in July of this year, I will be publishing in my journal the second symposium where Mario will be guest editor as well. Um, Back in April when we were discussing this, neither of us realized the what exactly we were in for. Here we are now a year later, and I don't think any of us and any of you would have predicted this, the severity of this pandemic and how it lasted for now a year and continuing with, I will say, really no end in sight despite the efforts at vaccination. Now, I just wanted to say that there will be a second webinar hosted by myself on March 23rd, which will have, again, same format, some papers from each of our journals. So I will be sending out that link soon enough, so please watch for it. In the meantime, I want to turn the floor over to my colleague. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Ottawa. I have known him for 35 years. He was my undergraduate professor, and he is now currently the editor of the International Journal of Political Economy. On that note, Mario, the floor is yours.
I wish to say a few words also about Louis-Philippe, and it was thanks to him that this thing got started. I mean, it was in April, he contacted me, and we thought it was a great idea, even though at the time we don't even know what, I mean, it was just starting up. Everything was, exploding at the time, and we had no idea what would be the outcome of this whole process here. Not so much about the journal thing, but just about the actual COVID crisis. How long would it be at the time? Everybody was saying, well, we'll probably see each other in the summer or even in the fall. In fact, even Ricardo, I remember, who had invited me there, we had to cancel at the time, had, we thought maybe it'd be over by the fall or even, I was invited to Mexico in May, and we decided to postpone it to November just to, give us enough time. So obviously things were very different then, and we had no idea. We had no rational expectations of what would be the outcome. But and indeed, we did come out with some rather important papers that were produced during this whole period. And we were able to expedite this and, to different degrees. I mean, obviously, our issue came out this winter, if you wish, while the rope one would be this summer. But nonetheless, both of them have as origin this sort of exchange we had at the time. And we thought that something important was developing. Okay, something very important, which was something bigger, if you wish, than what we saw with the global financial crisis. And it's certainly in terms of its debt, I don't know how you want to measure this, whether it be in terms of output growth or decline, should I say, whether it be in terms of unemployment, at least in the North American context here, okay, we've seen some dramatic changes going on here. But more importantly, also in terms of macroeconomic policy, there has been really a huge leap, let's call it, in the way things have in fact evolved on that front. I mean, the most important change is, of course, on the fiscal side. And not only has there been a huge explosion, let's say, of budget deficits and all that, but perhaps more importantly here is that that, for instance, if you take the case of Canada, just to show you what I mean here, we jumped to about 20% of GDP from like around 1% or 1.5% at the time, before the crisis. So there's a huge leap, but also, and this is something that, was never an acceptable thing, was this whole concept here of what traditional economists refer to as monetizing the deficit or the debt and all that, all of a sudden became rather common almost. And certainly in this country, it's been, there's a huge increase. Now, depending on the months, I've been actually looking at the buildup of reserves and how they connect with the deficit. And it's amazing to see to what extent that happened. And so it wasn't just QE, which we saw, let's say, in the case of, what happened during the global financial crisis. So in that regard, as I said, it's extremely important to see the changes that have gone on here, and on many fronts. Just one last example, when you look at trade side, once again, this is an area which, at least in this country, nobody would dare to question free trade, but now it's not so easy to defend it, especially in light of the fact that we are really pretty much captive of our own decisions, which are to have given up capacity to produce, in this case, vaccines here, which shows to what extent, at what extent we became vulnerable. And now what is happening is really this idea that you want to develop industrial policies to address these concerns. We want to have our made in Canada vaccines, et cetera. And there's been a big push in that direction over the last while. So just to suggest here that there's been a dramatic change in the way we look at policies generally. Okay, and it's in that light that we actually came out with these two special issues. As I said, in our case, we came out in December issue came out, literally came out early January, but it was the last issue of 2020. And there we had, we supposed to have had actually 5 papers, and unfortunately one of them did not come because of, in fact, ironically, because of COVID to a certain extent, that we were not able to have it delivered on time. And I just went ahead with it and just moved forward without that paper. But otherwise, all of these were papers that were committed to some 6 months earlier. And right now, I could say that I'm very happy with the outcome and got very good, feedback. And the same, I hope, will happen with the rope issue. Having said all that, I think we could now begin by starting with the first speaker on this, on the list of speaker, whose paper will be coming out in the rope issue. And it's Riccardo Bellofiore, who to some extent needs no introduction, and at least for our group here, for many of us here. And Riccardo is someone who I've known for a very long time. I first met him physically in person, okay? Although I had read some stuff of his before, in 1992 in Rimini at a conference on Hayek. So of all people and of all places here, we met there for the first time. And ever since we've hit it off, and I always had a wonderful relationship. And now he's happily retired, or I'm not sure if I should say happily, but certainly retired. In this case, he can't go very far, I suppose, but at least he could, he doesn't have to worry about teaching or correcting papers, et cetera, okay? He was professor of political economy at the University of Bergamo. And he, of course, his expertise are in the areas of macroeconomics, history of economic thought, and also international monetary economics. But he's done research in many areas of political economy, especially on money issues, on issues of, in fact, this is where the connection with maybe Hayek and Mises and so on comes from on the Austrian side here. Certainly not, he's not an Austrian economist, I must say. So it comes because of his research on endogenous money that does in fact bring in also this Austrian connection. But of course, he's most known for his views on well, obviously his research on Marxian economic theory, and also on the philosophy of economics. I won't go any further. I think I will just go ahead and ask Ricardo to begin, but let me just give you the title. The title is called The Winters of Our Discontent and the Social Production Economy.
Thank you, Mario. How long do we speak? 15
20
or
minutes.
20
You got
minutes?
20 minutes.
Yeah.
Let me put my voice here.
I came to Mises for a very simple reason. I was in the seminar on monetary theory by Graziani in Naples, 1981, 1985. From there, we decided, Graziani decided to have a collection of books of monetary theorists. Schumpeter was taken, Hayek was taken, then it remains Mises. The first time I tried to read Mises, I slept after 50 pages. The second time I was more successful, and when I arrived at the last couple of chapters, I became excited, but that has to do probably with perversion. You already said about the title. For some people, what I'm going to say will be very understood, will be expected. I will begin with some personal notes. I began my studies in economic theory in 73, 74. I was in my third year at university. I was studying law, actually. So why I shifted to economic theory? Well, I met a very special professor, Claudio Napoleone, but the historical conjuncture was relevant. There was a great crisis of capitalism, the biggest after the great crash of the 30s. There were social struggles. I was living in Turin, in Torino, the working class. And for those kind of struggles since the 60s, health in the labor process was a very crucial issue. The expression health is not for sale was a keystone of the struggles. And of course, 73, 74 means the first oil crisis, exactly when I was there in my class. Those years means also the debate on the second crisis of economic theory, the famous paper by John Robinson in 72. The paper was presented in December 71 at the American Economic Association. Here there is a paradox, because the second crisis of economics for me is not only a crisis of mainstream, but also a crisis of Keynesianism. And I think also Keynes himself. But if I have to explain the criticism of Keynes, well, the authors I'll use are paradoxically Keynesians, like John Robinson, like Minsky 75, or Marxists like Kalevsky, who was between the one and the other. Then, hence the title. There was a famous article by Frank Hahn in 73 on Econometrica titled The Winter of Our Discontent. It was related on this discussion about economic theory. Of course, Winter of Our Discontent is the title of a book by Steinbeck, but it refers to Shakespeare. And that was, I think, the point of Frank Hahn. And the article was about the general economic equilibrium, the theory, the crisis of general economic equilibrium, Kornai, and so on. I changed the winter of our discontent in the winters of our discontent. Why? The winters are 2020 and 2021, because Italy and Lombardy and Bergamo, especially where I am living, has been the heart, the center of the crisis. After China, I think the first place where it hit so violently. So at the time, I was thinking that I was, I don't know if to say lucky or unlucky. I lived two great capitalist crises, the crisis of Fordism and the crisis of money manager capitalism. What was not expected, though it should have been actually, is that the crisis of money manager capitalism was followed and so soon by the health crisis, the COVID crisis. I begin my paper, I will say something on the social production economy at the end. I begin my paper serving three perspectives on the COVID crisis, which I find intriguing. The first is by Draghi, the second is by Tools, and the third is by Kregel. Draghi, let me just say this, who is quite disappointing for the moment as Prime Minister, wrote a significant Financial Times article in March 2020. He said that we were as in times of war, and of course the reference is to World War I, World War II especially. The problem was not a lack of demand, not a collapse of funding. There was a choice of health and lives versus profit, and in the first wave it was a kind of incredible choice on which I have a quite positive judgment. Draghi is quite clear that government should take charge of firms' losses and giving subsidies. He is clear that the public debt over GDP rise is inevitable, that this rise is not only inevitable, but quite sustainable, given the current and prospective interest rates dynamics. Adam Tooze is even more interesting. Adam Tooze, of course, is the writer of this great book on the great financial crisis. Here I refer especially, he is an incredible prolific writer, so it is very difficult to follow him. Here I refer especially to some interventions during the exhaustion of the first wave and before the second wave. In some interviews and papers, he said more or less the following: we are now living the obsolescence of the myth of the central bank independence and the fading of the mythology of the aggressive capital markets. When these things began, they began in the 60s and 70s, when there was what Tooze defines as class war. So the political economy of inflation was the answer to the political economy of class war. And the antagonism in that period was on income distribution, on production, but also on output composition. Why obsolescence? There was the first shock, the financial worldwide crash, and then a second shock because the first was not enough, the COVID pandemics that had to clarify that the situation was different. Class war was won by bourgeoisie, but also we were not anymore in the period of the political economy of inflation. Rather, there was a risk of inaction of central banks and governments. Only overcoming this inaction, the COVID could have been could be overcome. So is this a lasting paradigm shift? Question mark by Tools. The third perspective, which I find even more intriguing, is the one by Jan Kregel. He wrote, he made some YouTube conference, then it became, in October, I think, a working paper by the Levy Institute. His position is even more radical. We have to go back to the New Deal policy of social provisioning, according to Kregel. So he is very well beyond Draghi and Tools, who refers actually to the Keynesian policy instrumentation. Kregel says there is no need for stimulus now. This does not mean that Keynes is not relevant. Keynes is relevant for his analysis of the uncertainty and so on. But the point is that we have to look at a different page of the New Deal. The problem was to endure GDP and employment losses through lockdowns and through quarantine, quarantines. And in this situation, the social provisioning must be directly provided by the government as the central organization, with a suspension of financial operation. So the point is necessity of central controls on the determination of product and distribution, a redirection of production with an equitable burden sharing. Kregel concludes, if you fight a war, this is what has been required in the past. After this first part, I go to European economic policy. And I say that actually, again, paradoxically, the COVID could have been a game changer for European economic policy. After 2012, Draghi, whatever it takes, and so on, there was a slow recovery in Europe. But in 2019, Europe was again on the verge of a serious crisis. In January 2020, just before the COVID, I published a paper with Francesco Garibaldo whose title was Le Dernier Métro, Europe on the Edge of the Abyss. And the idea was there is an oncoming crisis of the Eurozone, actually was quite there late 2019. And if there is not a change in the institutional architecture, well, the Eurozone will go slowly to some kind of end, not with a bang, but with a whimper, as a poet would say. Incredibly, the COVID-19 was an accelerator. The suspension of the Stability Pact, the ECB practically as a lender without limits, and so on. I say something, but in this paper, not too much about the discussion on financing. I said more in a paper, which is a kind of twin brother of this, even though the two papers are quite different on a lot of things. But I wrote in June of 2020, a paper which is published in the Monthly Review online. The point is that in European economic policy, now the idea of a mutualization of debt with a redistributive assignment rules of funds, in a sense, as one. Is this a new turn? I think, like my friend Francesco Saraceno, there are a lot of things that I don't agree with Francesco. I agree that the change is qualitatively radical, not quantitatively. It is not enough, and I'm not quite optimistic for the future. But from the qualitative point of view, there is the possibility of the construction of a true European budget. And my discussion on financing, if you read the paper, is understood only from this point of view, because reasonable choices about financing, even better than the one that they are now discussed in Europe, I don't judge as politically interesting now, because what is could be politically interesting is the creation of a true European budget going towards some federalization. But the real problem that escaped most of the debate, and this is the third part of the paper, especially the debate among the economists, is that the health crisis is not just an health crisis. It is not an exogenous crisis. This actually is more on their, also in Kregel, not in Tools, not in Adam Tools. The health crisis, says Adam Tools, it is the crisis of the Anthropocene. I would rather say Capitalocene, because it is a crisis of the capitalist social form. It is a crisis that should have been expected. It is one among many. Actually, there were already some before. It is not a black swan. It is, yes, a catastrophic punctual event, but this catastrophic punctual event reveals the pathological content which is hidden behind the normality of the capitalist social form. A Marxian, as you know, Mario, I am a Marxian, would say that here we have a case of fetishism. Social realities are seen as are transformed as something natural and unavoidable. Actually, Claudio Napoleoni made an interview in December of 1973 in which he said exactly this about the oil crisis. It will vanish. I'm not sure there will be others. The vaccine, I am all in favor of the vaccine, but yes, thank you. But I think that the idea that we will go out from this kind of phenomena with vaccines is not sensible. What we have now in front of us is the same issue that we had after World War I, with the New Deal, in the 70s class war, exactly the point of reference of the authors before. I think also paradoxically, in the great financial crisis, in a sense, from the opposite point of view, the issue that we have to deal is about production, what to produce, how to produce, how much to produce, and for whom to produce. The answer that I have always preferred is the answer by Minsky, a radicalization of Keynes' socialization of investment. I think that the COVID pushes us to radicalize the socialization of investment idea. In fact, if we go back to the origin of macroeconomics, this is very clearly the point. You know, for most of the people, even Keynesians, the origin of macroeconomics comes from the great crash and mass unemployment in the 30s. For me, it goes back to World War I.
On Zoom, and it was all right for a while, and it.
The issue of money's power to control the allocation of resources, which was a problem for Schumpeter. But the same Keynes, in a letter to Robertson in 36 after the general theory, says that the break was before in the mid-20s. And in a letter to Haberler in 38, he says that they were let out from classical economics because of the Great War. Exactly the money financing of government expenditure what allowed the immense diversion of resources for the production of liquid consumption goods. And after a while, Keynes and Robertson realized that this had the same effect as an increased investment in fixed capital during ordinary times. So I think that if we think through macroeconomics thoroughly, we have to supplement the principle of effective demand with the problem from which macroeconomics actually was born, and it is the problem of a conscious social orientation of the supply side. And it is here that I don't know if I'm the only one, no idea is particularly original, but I justice the term social production economy, which is of course opposed to the social market economy. As you know, Mario, social economy is a very ambiguous concept. But I think that here the point is to understand that the issue after COVID, and as in the other historical occasions that I told you, is the production of immediately social use values. Production of use values, which is immediately social. This, of course, for a Marxian like me, creates a huge problem. Because one thing is produce use values within production for capital. Another principle is the one behind the production of immediately social use values. And how you have some kind of bridge, some kind of transition, the problem can be actually confronted if you have a structural pressure, an objective structural pressure, and we have it, the crisis, if we have the subjective agency, movement from below, but we don't really have them. Actually, we are in a situation that Colin Crouch would call post-democracy. This is why I am quite pessimistic. So in Europe, we had one step beyond, but exactly what pushes us one step beyond is pushing us 2 steps back. We see how in Italy with the Draghi government, the idea of going out is not only through vaccine, but through a return of the state, which has built within it the privatization logic. It is not an issue of laissez-faire versus Keynesianism. I am at the end. It is not an issue of laissez-faire against Keynesianism. Is that the privatization logic may be within a new kind of state intervention. Here I can close. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You stuck pretty close, absolutely, 20 minutes. Thank you. I would like now to introduce the next speakers. In fact, it was supposed to be on the list. It was supposed to be Eugenia Correa and Wesley Marshall, but Eugenia is extremely ill and not at all. It's very, I'm very sad to say that. But in the case of Wesley, he's having problems right now with his Wi-Fi there.
Mario, I'm good. I'm good.
Oh, you're back. Oh, okay, good. Okay, then I guess we could get on with Wesley. Are you ready, Wesley? Are you okay there?
Yeah.
Okay, well, then let me just introduce our speaker here, which will be Wesley in this case, who is a professor at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana of Iztapalapa in Mexico City. And he is the, as some of you would know, he's also the associate editor of our journal here, the International Journal of Political Economy. He's on the editorial board, of course, of Ola Financiera, which I think he helped out from the beginning to start it up, I guess. And of course, he's also on the editorial board of the Review of Political Economy. So, I mean, he has his feet on both, both journals in some way, or actually more than that. And so without any further, ado here, I'll just ask Wesley to speak. The topic or the title, just to give you the exact title here, is The Crossroads, the Political Economy of the Pandemic.
Hello, everyone. I'm having some internet problems, so if it cuts off, I don't know if it'd be better to go to a different speaker or wait a second for me. But I've maybe 7 minutes of it being stable now. But it does sort of tie in because, well, I'll bring that tie in a second. But I'm very happy to go after Ricardo because there are some similarities to our presentations. We also did base ours off of a recent note in the press. And I really appreciate the ones that Ricardo described to us. We use Noami Klein's The Screen New Deal, the hope for a no-touch future. I might be butchering that name a little bit. We also do take the position that this is a moment of a great change, a historical watershed. We have taken the Polanyian as opposed to the Marxist angle. I think there are very much complementary thinkers on a lot of things. There are some conflicts between them. I tend to fall on the Polanyi side when those arise. But I don't want to get into any of those differences, but rather how they can complement at this point. The other thing we do is we are taking seriously the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, only because everyone else is taking it seriously. We see all our major presidents, bankers, IMF, all of that stuff. If anyone is curious and hasn't been there, please go to the World Economic Forum's Great Reset page. It's all open, it's all free. And it's funny to see how in some news outlets, if you mention it, is considered misinformation or conspiracy theory, but it's all right out in the open. You just go to their internet page. But so that would sort of be the introduction here. Now I'll get back to my terrible internet connection. My company, without our knowledge, sold about half of the clients in Mexico City to just an awful company. They put it in the wrong name and we can't even get it canceled. And what makes this terrible, so Naomi Klein mentions 3 things that I want to touch on here. And these are the new, as is often the case with disaster capitalism, health, education are always at the forefront, and so is money. And I want to get into those 3 through a Polanyian framework. But in terms of education, the difference between, it's great to see everyone here, it's nothing like a conference. However, I do think because I'm in public education, it's a much greater difference because the difference of social class, once we're outside of the classroom, really flourish. The classroom is the great social level playing field. In the classroom, we all have the same conditions to work and to study, especially in more peripheral areas. And I'm in at a peripheral university in the center city of a peripheral country, but but I get paid fine. I'm a professor. I can't get a good internet connection. Most of our students whose parents don't get paid well, having an internet connection is tough. Having a computer of your own to use, having a room to yourself, all of these things are elements that are very key to education and that very few of our students have. We see a lot of them, the educational quality is certainly falling, and I've seen this in the US as well. My wife, who teaches at the high school level, their big problem is just having the kids not kill themselves. We have big suicide problems, and education, in the lack of it, I think we really see how it's missed in terms of the aspect of social formation. And that's sort of a part of what we're talking about in the paper. But I want to step back and give the Polanyian angle that we're looking at all of this through. And this is one of, as opposed to mainstream economics, which assumes that the wider social space is in fact the market space. But from a common sense point of view and a Polanyian point of view, we have the biggest area, the biggest sphere is the social sphere. Within that, we have a market sphere and we have a state sphere. And I think what we're seeing now with the lockdown in money, I want to start on that one first, and then I'll go back quickly to education and to healthcare. Money is the easiest way to see this, because right now we have paper money. And the great thing about paper money, the paper money is created in the state sphere and in the market sphere. However, anyone in the social sphere with no dealings with the state, with no dealings with a company, can use money anonymously and freely. So in a country like Mexico, we have a lot of economic market space, which isn't in the formal market space because they're not dealing with companies. If I want to hire a carpenter to come to my house to make me a bookshelf, I just pay him with cash. There's no state involved, no company involved, except for the state or the company originates the money. But once it's in my hands, I can do with it what I want. And we have a lot of ways that that occurs, both in the center and the periphery, and both in the most developed and underdeveloped context. In the most developed context, in playing with the word development, we can go to Switzerland, where we find huge amounts of private hoards of cash. Now, if we go to the Cashless Society, which is very much a proposal that's been on the table since 2013, 2014, 2015, especially in that year, 2015, 2016, when the war on cash is really gets a lot of press. What we see here is the elimination of the social space of money, which is to say, all of this money that currently circulates in the social space, but outside of the pure purview of the state or the market, will now all be within those two domains, the state and the market. All money will be supervised and will be under vigilance. And this is, I think, the great trick of Bitcoin is all of its enthusiasts. What they want is to have money outside of state and market control. But all that they're doing, in our opinion, is hitching their wagon to a false promise that is only designed to make us all more comfortable and used to using a cryptocurrency. The IMF, Kenneth Rogoff have been very open about, and Paul Krugman have been very open about since 2014, the reason why we will need a cashless society. And that is because we can no longer on Wall Street, this is paraphrasing them, create any new bubbles. Interest rates are falling. And if we go into negative interest rates, because they're always on the loanable funds theory, the only way that we can get banks to loan out at negative interest rates is to make negative interest rates effective. This is what the IMF says as well. And the only way to charge people on cash holdings is to eliminate paper money and have it all be electronically, and to make negative interest rates effective, which only means basically a private tax on all wealth holdings, which has also been expressed in other ways. So I think the money one is probably the most, it would certainly be a huge change in, as Ricardo said, it would be a quantitative change, but overall it would be a qualitative change. And this one is also an interesting one. If we go back to, Naomi Klein puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that humans, we are all now biohazards. And I really like the idea of the human ideal to which we should all live up to. And we have seen for centuries how the great social economic thinkers have always spoken to this ideal of how we should act in society. And commonly under capitalism, it is we should, as under their conception that we're all in the market space and there is no social space, we should all act as market actors. That means guiding ourselves by the money motive, by profit, by personal value should be judged, not by who we are, but what we have and how much money we have. We can go back to Engels, who has the great quote that the only human connection is the cash nexus. And now if we fast forward today, we don't have the cash nexus. Today's ideal is not to see ourselves as market actors, but to see ourselves as a mortal threat to all other people. And before, if we look at the laundering of narco money in Mexico, we have the money is dirty, and then the same global banks who determine it's dirty determine how much they'll charge to clean it. But now we have the people are dirty. Because we're all biohazards, who can we trust now? Robots. And this is going to digital money, because this will all be, I say robot to sort of dramatize it a little, but when we're running on artificial intelligence software and program, there's all robot programming. It's not such a stretch. So with that in mind, we have a way to a new human ideal in that it is pushing open the state market sphere In the states, and markets are obviously much more connected than they have been in the past. And Polanyi is very clear about this, and we certainly embrace what he says. If we basically have two extremes, one can be that the social sphere controls the market sphere. And this is democracy. This is society controlling markets. The other options is to have the market sphere controlling all of society, and that is fascism. Now, as I said, and I want to be quick in finishing this, we have three spheres that under the lockdown are greatly reducing, so the social sphere greatly increasing the market state sphere. I mentioned money, education, certainly one of them. They are very clear in their enthusiasm for online learning, in the elimination of in-person learning. I think as professors, we can all see how that's really changes the whole spirit of education. I mentioned the inequality part of it. We can also go into the quality of education, how much we learn from our fellow students, the difference in being in a real classroom than being in a meeting like we are in now. Even just talking into computer for me is very difficult. I always bumble around in real life, but just talking at the black mirror is perhaps a bit worse. We also do have what we think, and there are a lot of signs of the coming crisis and consolidation of the education sphere. And it is interesting that if all we're going to do is online classes, I teach political economy. I have no illusion that I'm the best teacher in the world. Why don't I just put on David Harvey and have all my teachers? I'm not saying he's the best in the world either, but he's very popular and nothing against him. Why don't we just use him for all political economy classes? Why don't we just fire all of us? If we have one good person giving the class, we're all redundant. And especially our campuses become redundant. And wouldn't it be nicer, and this is what Mayor Cuomo, now under attack for other things, let's say, but he says this, and Naomi Klein cites him as this. We have all of this chance, we have all these opportunities for remote education in all of this real estate. And we certainly see it in Mexico City. In any case, the third and last one, which I will get to, is healthcare. And I'll finish before 5 minutes. Is the possibility to go to digital remote healthcare. I think the implications of that really get into the physical nature of what the COVID virus is, what the correct responses are. And if we look at the press, I think we can only come to the conclusion that what we are seeing now is neoliberalism doing natural sciences in the same way it's always done social science. Blame the victim, get everything wrong, polarize the issue, moralize the issue, and ensure that it's a disaster. The vaccine rollout, I saw a great article in the New York Times about a young Chinese man who said he was looking at how terrible the online registration form was for getting vaccinated. And he went out and made his own in 20 hours. He said he went into the codes, it was all done wrong, made his own, made it public, said it's terrible that the government isn't interested in this, but I guess I'll have to do it. And now we see Joe Biden saying, oh, it's just old people and minorities who can't use the internet. They're constantly getting everything wrong on purpose, creating this fear, frustration, impotence amongst the population, and just get everyone to fight it out amongst themselves. While at the top, we have, I think, what is probably history's first great financial bailout without a financial crisis. And this is what Paul Krugman and his pals were saying there's an exchange between him and Larry Summers in 2013, where Paul Krugman starts calling Larry Summers the Red Baron and all of this stuff. And they're complaining about the lack of any new bubbles and what we're going to do with secular stagnation, what we're going to do with falling interest rates, what we're going to do with deflation if we can't have any new bubbles. So I will close on that. And I'll semi-close on that. One last statement, certainly in, I think in unprecedented historical times, I don't think we have any history to really act as a guide at this point. So I congratulate Louis Philippe, Mario Seccareccia for getting all of us together. And I think it will be very valuable for the future, at least of the profession, to have us all debated out. We're going to have a lot of different positions, and time will tell, but it's great to have this diversity of ideas, of authors, and I hope it is a fruitful debate. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation here. By the way, I should warn people. I mean, you probably figured it out already. We're gonna have the questions, after the presentations. So we'll go on right now with the third speaker. In fact, perhaps Giuseppe could correct me here, but I think it might be two speakers, not just one. But I'll, at least from what I gather here, will be Giuseppe Fontana, who is a professor of monetary economics at the University of Leeds. And there's also, he is the associate professor at the same time at the Università del Sannio in Italy and in Benevento. And he is also a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute in the US and at the Cambridge Center for Economic and Public Policy in the UK. Now, his publications are in the area of post-Keynesian economics, specifically on endogenous money theory, also on identity and stratification economies, that is to say, gender inequality issues, also on ecological macroeconomics, and also more generally in macroeconomics, of course, monetary fiscal policies. And he was member also, he mentions here, of the coordinating team, the executive board, and the work package leader of the 8 million EU, European Union here, FP7 research project, FESUD, which was on financialization. I remember very well, okay? So he sat on 8 million euros, which is quite a handsome sum here. Now, he was an elected board director and member of the Eastern Economic Association from 2011 to 2014, and also president of the Association for Social Economics in 2017-2018. So there may be, and I'm not sure, perhaps Giuseppe could correct me on this, if there's also Rosa Canelli who will be speaking as well. Because if not, there are in fact actual 4 authors to this paper. And the authors are, of course, Rosa Canelli, Giuseppe Fontana, Marco Veronese Passarella, and Riccardo Rialfonso. And the title of the paper is Public Debt Sustainability After the COVID-19 Crisis, the Case of Italy. So Giuseppe?
Yeah, I think now I can unmute myself.
Oh, okay, okay, good.
Good afternoon or good evening to everyone. And thank you very much, Mario, for the this introduction. I was blushing. Fortunately, probably you couldn't see on the screen with all these lovely words about myself. Far too generous, I would say. I should thank Louis Philippe and Mario for kindly inviting myself, Rosa, Marco, and Riccardo to be part of the special issue in Europe and to be part of this seminar. I prepared some slides. I wonder if I could share the slides. I don't know if you can see the slides.
Yes, yes.
So as Mario was saying, this is a joint paper with Rosa Canelli and Riccardo Alfonso from the University of Sannio and Marco Veronese from the University of Leeds. And basically the main goal of this paper is in the title. Really what we are doing is asking ourselves if the European Union policy are effective to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. And we draw on the case of Italy. And in a sense, we are very close to some of the things said before by Riccardo when talking, Wesley, when we were talking about the response to the COVID-19 crisis. So this is the structure of the presentation, which reflects in a sense the structure of our paper. So first of all, we look at the European Union response, so the policymaker of the European Union to the COVID-19 crisis, and compared to what happened in 2007, 2008 with the global financial crisis. This is really an unprecedented response, in line with what Riccardo was saying, before me. We also look at the Italian government policy response, because as was said before, as part of the EU response, there was the possibility of relaxing some of the budgetary constraints that were enforced before. So the policymaker in Italy also had some maneuver here, some policy response. This is sort of the first part of the paper. In the second part of the paper, we develop a stock flow consistent macroeconomic model for the Italian economy. Here we draw on work that Marco had done, Marco Veronese Pastrella already has done in terms of stock flow consistent model for the Italian economy. And of course, on one of the maestros of the stock flow consistent model, that is Gennaro Zezza and his team. And Gennaro and Francesco Zezza indeed have a very interesting paper on the Italian economy. In the third part of the paper, then we discuss the findings and the forecasts that come out from our stock flow consistent model. And on the basis of the outcome of that, we suggest, or we explore, actually more than suggest, we explore different policy scenario alternative to the current one. We have actually one scenario that goes back to the old austerity scenario and what will mean in the current economic situation, and 4 alternative expansionary EU policy. And I will possibly, given the time constraint, only focus on one policy, and we will see then the conclusion that we can derive from that type of analysis. So very quickly, in terms of the EU policy response, as I was saying, it is really unprecedented because, compared to what happened in 2007, 2008, there has been a strong intervention by the European Central Bank as well as the European Council. So the ECB has maintained a low discount rate and has introduced the so-called PEP, the Pandemic Emergency Program. More importantly, in a sense, for our research was to look at the European Council, which has introduced a package of fiscal intervention to relaunch investment. The famous or unfamous so-called NGEU, so the Next Generation EU, basically loans and grants to member states that are worth 360 billion euros and 390 billion euros respectively. So 360 billion euros in loans and 390 billions in terms of grants. There are also other extraordinary measures, the so-called SURE, the support to mitigate unemployment risk and in emergency, there is the European Stability Mechanism crisis support, and of course there is the European Investment Bank. Another interesting things that in a sense introduce my next slide is there has been a suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact and other institutional budget constraints, which has allowed member states to enact some sort of fiscal response within the European Union. Now, we look at how effective are the European Union policy response to the COVID-19 crisis by looking at the case of Italy. And for people that are maybe not familiar to the European Union, and maybe to the Italian case in the European Union, it would be worth to introduce why we focus on Italy. I mean, apart the reason that there are 4 Italians writing the papers. Well, Italy is the 3rd largest economy in the European Union, and is also the main economy that has not yet recovered the global financial crisis level of GDP at the end of 2019. So there is a quite long-term discussion about the health of the Italian economy, as Riccardo Bellofiore was mentioning before. And even before the COVID-19 crisis, Italy had the highest government debt to GDP ratio in the European Union after Greece. So again, one of the reasons why we are focusing on Italy is that there are certainly a weak economy and a very high government debt to GDP ratio that's seen only in a sense the precarious position that Italy has started with before the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, there is also the issues about the health crisis. Italy is one of the hardest hit country in the world for the COVID. So in terms of the Italian policymaker, the Italian government launched additional fiscal measures to contain the negative impact of the COVID-19 crisis. As a result of that, the deficit to GDP ratio was around 10% at the end of last year, circa 108 billion euros, and the government debt to GDP ratio was close to 160%. So you can see what we mean, that in a sense, Italy is an interesting case because of the weight that has within the European Union, but also because of the particular economic situation that characterizes Italy. In terms of the effect of the EU policy on Italy, the PEP by the ECB did affect the cost of refinancing the Italian government, though still at the end of 2020 recorded a spread of 130 points over the 10-year German bonds. In terms of the fiscal intervention, so for instance of the NGU funds available to Italy for the period 2021-2025, they are expected to be, and I said expect to be because of course there is still quite a lot of space for political discussion and agreement, but I expect to be around 127.6 billion euros in loans out of the 360 available for all member states, and 81.9 billion euros grants of the 390 billion euros. So this is data that we try from the official government data. So on the base of that, we look at the building, as I said, a stock flow consistent macroeconomic model. And as I said here, Marco had quite a lot of expertise already, Marco Veronese Passarella, because he had done a model of Italy. And we draw, of course, on other models, in particular, the Gennaro Zezza and Francesco Zezza model of Italy, stock flow consistent model of Italy. So the aim of this model was just to assess, as I said, the impact on the Italian economy of the EU policy to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. For people that are not familiar with stock flow consistent macroeconomic model, although they are becoming very, very popular, especially among the people that are in this audience, they basically, I think they started to be popularized thanks to the work of Godley, building on a long, of course, tradition going back to Tobin and other economists in the past. Godley and Lavoie made famous the stock flow consistent model to a large audience. What we did, we developed a medium scale structural macroeconomic model that was stock flow consistent. And the model was coded and calibrated using the software framework BIMETS that was provided by the Bank of Italy. In terms of data, we used annual time series data over the period 1995-2019. And we have 6 macro factors: firms, bank, central bank, the ECB, the government, household, and the foreign sector. What we did basically, we used the time series data that we have from 1995 to 2019 to look at the behavior of key macroeconomic variables describing the Italian economy. And then we consider some of shocks as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we divided the shocks in terms of economic factors, so economic shocks, and policy factors, in other words, the policy response. So among the economic factors, we had the direct effect of the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the Italian economy for changes of the labor force, product per employee, and the GDP of trading partners. In terms of policy factor, we consider the reduction in tax revenue and additional spending by the Italian government, the effect of the ECB PEP program in terms of markdown on the average interest rate on the Italian government bonds, and in terms of the fiscal response, we look at the loans and grants to Italy and the way in which they were allocated, at least according to the criteria of the Italian government. And that produced what we call the baseline. And we look in particular what happened as a result of those shocks. In particular, the EU policy, and therefore if they are effective or not for Italy over the periods 2020-2025. So here we have, in a sense, in this table, you can see the main assumption they have made in terms of economic factors, in terms of policy factors. Given the time constraint, I will not go through these basically shocks, but they are derived from the data available from the Italian government and the main European and international institutions. So we haven't, in a sense, done anything specially except to take the values that are accepted as a consensus by not only Italian policymaker, but European international policymaker. And here we come to basically the main findings and forecast. So basically what you have here is the black line here. Let me see if I can use the spotlight. Maybe that will help. Yeah, it should be able. Okay, so this figure here represents the real GDP, and you have the black line, and then you have the dotted line. So the black line represents the baseline of the model, of our model. So it shows the observed pre-shock path of the real GDP, and of course applies also to the other variable. Basically, it's the time series from 1995 to 2019, okay? Together with the stock flow consistent model forecast, in other words, forecast coming out from our model for the period 2020-2025. So basically, this is a time series for Italy. This is what will be the path of the variable, in this case, real GDP, if they will not be in absence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is the shock that our model, the forecasts that come out from our model, once we consider what has happened in terms of the Italian economy, the three variables that we described before in terms of economic factors, and the policy response, in particular the EU response in terms of ECB and in terms of European Council. And the interesting things here that you can see is that basically the GDP here is the evolution of GDP. Or I should say, we are using the 2007 as our base year. And so as you can see clearly from this figure, the GDP is expected to be well below 2000 level in the near future. So this is the peak that Italy registered in 2007. And remember, Italy has already a very weak economic outlook in the past few years. So basically, even with the European Union policy response, GDP stay well below the 2007 peak. So we will never recover the 2007 level of real GDP. And in a sense, even more worrying is that the path, as you can see, after the rebound, thank you, Mario, after the rebound, you will see that there is a stagnation. In fact, I don't have time to go through the growth rate, but if you look at the growth rate of Italy, you will see that after the a sharp increase in 2021 and 2022, then actually decline rapidly toward the zero. The other key aspect here is, of course, that we want to focus on attention is the government debt to GDP ratio. And you can see that there is a huge jump, of course, as a result of the pandemic. And there is a reduction in the government debt to GDP ratio as a result of this rebound in growth in 2021 and 2022. But immediately after, you can see that the government debt to GDP ratio keep increasing. And in fact, this is actually in opposition to what was happening before the pandemic. So the key result here is that despite the unprecedented policy response by the EU, actually the government to debt to GDP ratio start to increase at a quite unprecedented level in the near future. So again, here we have data that confirms that type of analysis for the deficit, for the employment level, but for reason of time, I will not go to that. As I said, what we had in our paper is different. So given that basically the EU policy response, unprecedented as it is, will be actually not very effective in making more sustainable actually the economy in Italy. What can be done? So we explored alternative scenario, including an alternative scenario for people that were keen in the past for that type of policy. I don't have time to go through all the scenarios. They are at the end of the slides, which I can circulate. But basically, we look at one particular scenario here. That's what we call the back to trend scenario. So this is an alternative expansionary money finance fiscal policy by the EU. So it's a thought experiment. So we ask what will take to bring the Italian economy, in particular the GDP, back to the trend before the COVID-19. And so we will take as a thought experiment an increase of the EU resource equal to 25% of the current planned NGU funds to Italy. So there is, of course, a quite strong assumption here. So a 25% increase. Also, we assume that all the additional EU resources are financed by the EU authority. In this case, that means that there will be no increase in government debt as a result of this increase. They are entirely converted into new spending, because most of the time, only 70% of EU resources are converted in new spending. 30% are used to finance previously planned government expenditure. And also, we don't make up any contribution by the Italian government. And you can see here the result. I know time is not on our side, but basically, you will see that as you expected, because we impose as a scenario that real GDP will go back to trend. You can see the trend before the 2019 crisis. So you will not be surprised to see that real GDP goes back to trend. But what is interesting is government debt to GDP ratio actually decline rapidly. So in other words, there will be a reduction in the government to GDP ratio. And of course, I look at the other figure in terms of the deficit to GDP ratio, in terms of the employment level, in terms of the average interest rate of government debt. And maybe I would just outline that there is nothing happening to inflation. So this policy will not change significantly the inflation outlook for the future. So, because I'm aware that there is time constraint, what our paper tells the story is that certainly domestic and the EU policy in response to the COVID-19 pandemic have slowly halted the dramatic decline in GDP and employment in Italy. So in that sense, they are emergency measures that were welcome. And they also have temporarily delayed a further increase in its government debt to GDP ratio. But those policies are not going to bring either the government finance or GDP or the employment to pre-COVID-19 levels, let alone to bring those indicators to a more sustainable long-term levels. We have presented here the back to trend scenario forecast, where we had the 25% expansion of the energy fund, which were, again, this can be controversial, but could be as a total experiment used at this stage, entirely financed by the ECB and entirely spent by the Italian government. And what we have seen is that this has a remarkable positive impact, not only on GDP, but also, importantly, because some people are worried about that, the government finances in Italy. So in a sense, what our scenario tells us the story is that EU monetary and fiscal authority have the power to move the Italian economy towards a path for more sustainable growth with positive outcome for both employment and government finances. And I will stop here. Thank you, Mario.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giuseppe, for a most interesting presentation. Also, in terms of the prognosis here, maybe it might, some of us might feel it's very optimistic, but I'm glad to see that that's the, that you're able to grind that out. And I'm very happy to, and I thank you very much for that. Let me then go on to the last speaker, okay? Now, this is a paper that we published in the International Journal of Political Economy, a paper written by Matthias Vernengo and Suranjana Nabar Baduri. The title of the paper is The Economic Consequences of COVID-19, the Great Shutdown and the Rethinking of Economic Policy. To my understanding, the speaker will be Suranjana Nabar Baduri. She is an assistant professor of economics at Frostburg State University, and her areas of specialization include macroeconomics, development economics, and international economics. And as I said, this is a paper that has been written with Matthias Vernengo, who really has, doesn't need much of an introduction in this group here. But I could just say that he, of course, is a professor of economics at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. And his interests are in macroeconomics, economic development, and the history of economic thought. But I'm assuming that Suranjana will be the one doing much of the presentation. So Suranjana, could you please?
So thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Louis-Philippe and Mario, for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint related to our paper. So, okay, I'm sharing the PowerPoint. Do you see it? Okay. Okay, so what we do in this paper is we focus on the implications of the COVID-19 crisis for macroeconomic policy and the role of the state and the Fed and monetary policy in the US economy. And what we emphasize is that this crisis is going to reinforce policy trends that began during the 2007-2009 Great Recession, specifically trends in terms of the growing relevance of counter-cyclical fiscal policies and monetary policy. What we also suggest is that geopolitical concerns in the United States associated particularly with the rise of China as a global power, and which have been aggravated by the pandemic, is also likely to be another contributing factor that will reinstate in the US economy. And furthermore, the financing needs that will be required as a part of the large-scale fiscal intervention will reinforce trends with respect to the role of the Fed as the fiscal agent of the US Treasury, a role that has been previously witnessed during the 1930s Great Depression and more recently in the 2007-2009 Great Recession. So if we look at the debate on whether this current crisis is a demand or supply side one, studies recognize that the present crisis has both supply and demand side dimensions. Specifically on the supply side, the lockdown measures that were implemented in March and April to control the spread of the virus meant that large sectors of the economy, especially services that involve close interpersonal contact, were shut down. And as a result of these lockdown measures, firms were prevented from producing goods and services, and there were large-scale layoffs, which made this crisis a supply-side one. But in turn, people who lost their jobs, who were laid off or furloughed, reduced their spending. And additionally, you also had people reducing their spending on services where the risk of contagion was high out of fears of contracting the virus. So this then spread the crisis to other sectors of the economy and also made this crisis a demand-driven one. So what we argue in this paper is that we agree that there are both demand and supply elements to the crisis, but we emphasize that the present problem, the fundamental problem, is a collapse of demand in certain sectors, particularly services. Because if you look at the challenges that firms have been facing in terms of acquiring intermediate inputs because of a disruption in supply chains, while they're not irrelevant, they are small compared to the massive increase in unemployment claims, which clearly suggests that the contraction of demand is a much greater factor in the current crisis. What we also emphasize is that the types of demand and supply shocks that have hit the economy are localized, affecting some sectors more than others, and uneven. So addressing these shocks require targeted interventions, which on the demand side would allow affected families and individuals, laid off workers outside the formal labor market to be able to pay their bills, meet their day-to-day expenses feed their families. And additionally, we also need targeted policy interventions that on the supply side will redirect production to sectors that are likely to experience a surge in demand. What also differentiates the present crisis from previous recessions is that this recession is a services-led recession. So this graph that I'm showing now shows the share of consumption of services as a percentage of GDP from the end of the Second World War. And as you notice, from about 25% of GDP, the share of services in GDP has increased to 45% over time. Also, in previous recessions, the services sector was largely acyclical, but in the present recession, the services sector has turned strongly pro-cyclical. And this dominance of the services sector in GDP is also mirrored by the share of the services sector in non-farm employment. At the moment, nearly 85% of the non-farm employment in the US economy is in the services sector. So the large-scale lockdown measures that were implemented last year were bound to have significant negative effects on employment and job levels in the US economy. What we also did in our paper was to look at the recovery of employment from the onset of the crisis and compare it to employment recovery in previous major recessions, specifically the Great Recession, the 1981-82 recession, and the collapse after World War II. And there has been this perception amongst many economists and observers that the present recovery is going to be a V-shaped recovery, largely because of the relatively faster recovery of employment compared to previous recessions. But we are cautious because the most significant gains occurred last year during spring and early fall as a result of the relaxation of lockdown measures. And after this rebound in the early spring and fall period, job gains did slow down. And despite the somewhat stronger gains that have been witnessed in the last month of February, the recovery process is still likely to be slow till vaccines become more widely available. And also with new variants of the virus emerging, it's not possible to completely dismiss the possibility of restrictions and a pattern of opening and closures continuing to persist into 2021 and possibly 2022. So notwithstanding the relatively faster recovery of employment that has been witnessed over the last few months, restoring employment to the pre-pandemic levels is still going to be rather slow. Given that restoring employment to the pre-pandemic levels is going to be a slow process because of the uncertainties that still remain, notwithstanding positive developments in the form of the introduction of vaccines and their gradual distribution. The slow recovery of employment and the extent of the crisis means that there is going to be a need for massive fiscal intervention to sustain the economy during the intervening time. And this is in turn going to have implications for the net federal debt, which is the federal debt excluding the debt that's held by the Federal Reserve System and the Social Security Trust. So this graph here shows the evolution of the net federal debt as a percentage of GDP over time. And if we look at what happened during the 2007-2009 recession, the large-scale adoption of counter-cyclical fiscal measures have increased the size of the federal debt. There was some downward trend in the federal debt in the second half of the 2010s, but then the trend again began to move in the upward direction following the 2017 tax cuts. So what we emphasize is that restoring pre-pandemic employment levels and GDP growth is going to require extensive fiscal effort. The recent 1.9 trillion relief package, which is on the verge of being passed, is certainly a positive sign. However, the implications of these kinds of extensive fiscal interventions for the public debt GDP ratio are likely to mean that calls for fiscal austerity are going to persist and become stronger in the near future. And these calls are likely to pose stronger challenges to similar initiatives going forward. There is a need for a large-scale infrastructural plan as well, which could also help to boost the recovery process and help to promote job creation and economic growth. But because of political challenges and calls for fiscal austerity, this is likely to make it more challenging to implement these kinds of initiatives. And this is also likely to slow down the recovery process and not make it a completely V-shaped recovery. Furthermore, apart from the fiscal intervention that's needed to restore employment to the pre-crisis levels and growth, and also to provide relief to families and individuals who've been affected by the present crisis and maintain them during the crisis, we're also likely to see a growing role of the state in the US economy, which is associated with growing geopolitical concerns connected to the rise of China as a global power over the last decade, which has been aggravated by the pandemic. Now, given the implications in terms of large-scale fiscal intervention and a growing role of the state, which is also the result of geopolitical concerns, there are also going to be implications for the role of the Fed in the US economy. So in this graph here, what we have is the balance sheet of the Fed from the early 2000s. And what you'll notice is that right before the Great Recession of 2007-2009, the main items in the Fed's balance sheet consisted of notes and bonds and bills. As a result of the Great Recession of 2007-2009, you have had a significant enlargement in the Fed's balance sheet over time as a result of quantitative easing, something that had also been previously seen during the Great Depression. But apart from the quantitative aspect, you also see a qualitative change in the composition of the balance sheet, specifically a movement to more long-term assets like notes and bonds, and also a large increase in the holdings of mortgage-backed securities that were the result of the Fed's policy efforts to deal with the housing market crisis. And this has helped to keep long-term interest rates low, So in this sense, the Fed is also acting as a fiscal agent of the Treasury, not only in terms of buying bonds, but also helping to facilitate the sustainability of the federal debt by keeping the cost of servicing this debt low. And this also then facilitates the implementation of massive expansionary fiscal policies. Now, in 2018, the Fed had announced that it was going to gradually unwind its balance sheet over time, because there was this perception that the economy was close to full employment, and there were concerns that the economy might overheat in the near future. But in 2019, the Fed reversed this course, mainly because of a realization that although unemployment rates were extremely low, around 3.4%, the US economy was still nowhere close to full employment, and unwinding the balance sheet too soon was likely to entail the risk of an economic crisis. Then we have the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis, which has again seen a reemergence of a growing balance sheet of the trend. And the trends that were previously seen during the 2007-2009 crisis have again been reinforced in terms of a growing share of long-term assets in the form of notes and bonds in the Fed's balance sheet. And we also see an emergence of bills again. So to conclude, the current crisis will affect thinking on the role of macroeconomic policy, the role, thank you, I'm coming to an end, and on the role of the state and the relation between the Fed and the Treasury. Both demand and supply side factors are relevant to the crisis, but in our view, it's the sudden and widespread collapse of demand that's the main underlying cause. Tackling the present crisis requires extensive fiscal intervention. Specifically, we need interventions, targeted interventions that on the demand side maintain the spending abilities of families and individuals facing cash flow problems. The recent passage of the 1.9 trillion relief package is a positive sign. On the supply side, policies need to be directed towards production in sectors that are likely to experience a surge in demand. But these extensive fiscal efforts going forward are likely to be countered by increasing calls for fiscal austerity. So these increasing calls for fiscal austerity are likely to increase and pose challenges to enacting similar subsequent policy efforts in future. And despite the stronger job gains in the last month compared to what we'd seen since October, the recovery of employment is likely to be slow till vaccines become widely available, and the uncertainty with respect to the new variants of the virus and what they imply for the ability of the economy to resume normal operations become a little clearer. So unemployment is likely to remain above pre-pandemic levels for the near future. Apart from the massive fiscal interventions, geopolitical concerns associated with the rise of China are also likely to contribute to an increasing role of the state in the US economy. And the tremendous financing needs of fiscal interventions and the developmental state are likely to reinforce certain trends with respect to the role of the Fed as the fiscal agent of the Treasury, a role that it had previously performed during the Great Depression and which reemerged during the Great Recession. And this is pretty clear from the growing size of the Fed's balance sheet since the last crisis, and also more so in the shift in the composition of assets from short-term bills to longer-term notes and loans. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suranjana, for an excellent presentation. And I am now looking at the clock here, and I think we have about 10 minutes here, so we could take at least a couple of questions or 2-3 questions that can come from whoever here wants to intervene at this point, or if you want to perhaps put it on chat there and we could all take a look at it. If you would like to write it up. If not, just show up and Louis-Philippe, yes. Yeah.
Yes,
Yes, Louis.
yeah. First of all, thank you. I really much enjoyed all 4 papers, and I'm really not really surprised that a lot of the consensus, a lot of the very similar ideas are coming out. I do have a question that was touched upon a little bit by Giuseppe and Suranjana, but I want to take this opportunity to ask, I guess, the other panelists. The OECD today came out with a report um, remarking on the robust recovery that is taking place. The Bank of Canada today has announced that it might start raising interest rates before the end of the year. It was at the time thinking, yeah, Mario, I know, you know. So here in Canada, we were under the impression that interest rates would stay low well into next year. And people like Paul Krugman is saying, once we get vaccinated, the economies will go back to equilibrium very quickly. Some of the panelists here have said that may not be the case. I'd like to hear what other people think on the panel. What is going to be the speed of this recovery after vaccination? Ricardo, maybe? You have to unmute yourself, Ricardo. I know it's technology.
Yeah, I absolutely have no idea, but I am not so convinced that vaccine is the solution. It depends. From the point of view of Italy, my point is a strict lockdown, a big supply shock, like Kregel proposed, would not have been resolutive of the greater problem that we are going to meet in the future, but in the same time could have destroyed the virus, and then you have the tracing. What happened from the first wave to the second wave is that the arbitration between lives and the profits production changed. Here it is very, very clear. The lockdowns are not true lockdowns and so on. And in the meantime, the virus is changing. And the vaccines that we have are not resolutive all the way. So I'm sure that we will go out from this hell, but with a kind of cycle which will be also promoted by newspapers and by politics, etc. And so my preoccupation is not reaching quickly a defined new old normal, that the normal will be redefined politically from the newspaper point of view and so on. So what I think is that there is now a political and cultural and democratic need to redefine the discourse. No, I don't know if it is clear what I am saying. If we look, if it is a V or the V is low and so on, this is part of the story. The other part of the story is that we have to realize that both the supply and the demand must change, and this requires a dramatic change of our way of produce and of consuming. And what was exciting for me, but at the same time scaring, what to see that John Cochrane, you remember John Cochrane, was writing in his blog in something like April or May, exactly what I'm saying to you, just as he was saying, there will be an adjustment, spontaneous adjustment, but radical adjustment, and we have to go that way. Either we are able to produce a political adjustment with some sort of partially planning, etc., or we will, it will be irrelevant if we go to an higher GDP. Sorry, I've been too long, but I hope you understand where I was heading.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions that people have? And as I said, we have about, what is it, less than 10 minutes now to.
Could I give a quick answer to the same question?
Sure, please, please.
And sorry to sort of butt in, but I was.
No, I'm glad. If you have others who want to address that of the speakers, please go ahead.
I'll be quick. I'll be quick.
No, please.
Again, taking advantage of going right after Ricardo. I do like the concept of, I find it descriptive, I don't want to say like the K recovery, where we see a continuation of those who, the financial rentiers versus everyone else. Financial rentiers, you're going to be fine. Everyone else will not be. But to differ from Ricardo's answer, I'm going to give my answer of the recovery is, who knows? And I want to say they don't know. And I'll give you just a quick example. For example, for me, I know nothing. For me, it's such a mystery how with no government support and everything fairly locked down in Mexico, the poorest of Mexican citizens are still eating. I don't understand it. There's obviously going to be only so many answers to that question. But to hear people talking about GDP recovery, I think it's an interesting exercise, which I've done many times, just to walk around, get a feel of things. There are videos on YouTube of people going through in their car, just seeing all the closed stores in New York and Los Angeles. Walking around Mexico City, my guess, just taking a guess, is that we're at about 50% of production. Just taking a very broad picture and just looking out, seeing activity and just taking a guess. It's beyond my comprehension how people can say that we're now about to be overheated. And I think it goes to the point that GDP measures are always very interesting, have very serious limitations of what gets measured and what doesn't. And I think if we just give it the eye test and the smell test of walking around where we live, I gotta think Mexico's pretty ahead of a lot of these other places, and I can't see us being at above 60% of potential GDP, potential production, let's say. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, Joelle.
Yeah, I guess I was just like in the same line of thinking. I guess I wanted to know, like, before COVID hit, we were all ready for a recession to hit. You know, we were all ready for a recession to come. We're like, yield curve, you know, became inverted. We were ready for it. Unemployment was very low, but we were like, still, we're not capturing, you know, a lot of the population. Millions of people are still, even when we have very low levels of unemployment, we still are not capturing a large number of people that are officially unemployed or underemployed or, you know, discouraged workers that should have jobs. And now that we have COVID and we have this massive government, has that allowed our government to like spend more in the economy? Has it allowed the government to pass these stimulus packages in excess of what they would normally because of the COVID justification, which maybe has helped people? And then are we, you know, like here in the US right now, we have a 6.3% unemployment rate the last time I checked, which was you know, a lot better than we had been at the beginning of the crisis. So we are in a recovery, but you know, it's true that we're still, even if we arrive to 3% unemployment, we're still going to have a bunch of people unemployed. Are we really changing the structure? And like, I guess there's all those questions that I have about the current recovery and how it's maybe combined the COVID crisis with another recession that we were kind of got covered up.
Anyone wants to comment on that, or should I just take another question? There's Ignacio Perotini here.
Yeah,
well, question. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you. Well, congratulations to all of the presenters. I mean, they were great presentation. Well, listening to Sorunjana and Matthias' presentation, it occurred to me the following question. I mean, the QE and the recovery package that was introduced by the Fed and the US government back in 2007, 2008, 2009, and so on so forth, made the US society more unequal, despite the recovery package, despite so much QE and so on so forth. So what you are saying then, that it seems that the US society will become even more unequal as a result of the COVID crisis, as a result of this, I mean, in particular because of the demand side impact of the COVID. What do you think about that?
Anyone wants to, the speakers want to comment? Actually reply either to Joel, who so far no one, or to Ignacio. No. Well, anyone else who would like to speak?
Just a little comment. I put a link in the chat. A study that came out today by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that Mario knows very well. They do excellent work, and it's about women in COVID, which we didn't talk about, and they are arguing that it's going to take a decade or more to go back to pre-COVID conditions, situations for women. So do have a look at that if you want. And I think Mario, Domenica Tropiano wants to ask a question.
Yes, but unmute yourself, Domenica.
No, I want just to make an observation and might be a question to Ricardo, in the sense that it's both things, because I think he just drew the conclusion that the change that was coming in Europe was on one hand it was good because it was there was the introduction of some sharing of debts, but that the state intervention was not direct, was directed towards goals which were not goals that could be shared, at least from his point of view. And I've read one of Draghi's speech in which he was describing that the result after the pandemic or during the pandemic, there should be the necessity of a sort of Schumpeterian process of distinguishing between the firms that can survive and the firms that have to die during the crisis. And what is happening now is just that, at least in European publication, there is the idea that in order to help those firms who have to die, who have to go bankrupt, then the best thing to do is just to enlarge the market functioning, in the sense that there will be some market entities who will work to make this bankruptcies work, or will buy the firms who are going to have problems and difficulties in the crisis. And this will increase the weight of market finance with respect to the weight of bank financing, which is traditionally, particularly in Southern European countries or in peripheral countries, the normal way in which firms and small firms in particular finance themselves. So this, from this point of view, I think beyond the novelty, which is an important novelty, that is the sharing of debts, at least a part of debts that will be incurred with the new Next Generation EU and so on. On the other hand, from the micro point of view, the mainstream reasoning is there, and it goes on.
Should I answer?
Okay, we'll take.
No, maybe it was not really a question, or maybe I don't
Okay.
know whether
Oh, yeah. Okay. No, I understood there was a part of a question, but it's okay. There is another one who wants to intervene.
I think we are towards the end here. So, let's just say that I'll take a reply here from either of the speakers right now to what well, Domenico has about, or indeed even others that were not, whose questions were not addressed here directly.
There is one question.
But if not, we'll go and we'll just stop at this point. Yeah, sorry. Yes,
but Gianluca Frigani has a question.
Oh, okay.
If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question. My bad, then I guess not.
I don't see anybody else here who's offering. Okay, well, look, at this point, I think let me first thank all the speakers, I mean, for the effort that really it takes, it is draining just to, present at a screen something. I find it more difficult than talking to people, So in that regard, I'm quite privileged because I haven't been teaching for a while now, and it feels great when I look at what my colleagues have to endure over this last while, So in that regard, I'm extremely happy that I'm retired. But at the same time, I do want to say that, it is really a privilege to have been involved in this session here in this specific webinar series. In fact, there's going to be a second one in a couple of weeks that I hope everybody would also attend, which is really a follow-up to this one. But we were very happy with the actual outcome of these two specific, special issues that were put together, as I said, to try to shed some light on what happened, what is to be done as well, and for whom, as indeed Ricardo reminded us at the beginning. And these are the sort of issues that I think are going to be plaguing all the future policy debates in the next while, which will be primarily for whom. I mean, look at what's happening right now with all these fears about inflation and all that, and how they're going to try to ram through our throats against some sort of austerity program in the very near future. And these are the issues that are going to be confronting us for the next while, for sure. So this is so important that we have a say on this, and we are putting out our ideas here so that we can, to some extent, maybe not stop this kind of tractor that might be running over us again, but at least tell people why to, how to get out of the way and be careful, because this is what's happening, So in that regard, I think having said that, I do have a much more positive outlook from all this, because I do believe that what it has done is that both the global financial crisis of a dozen years ago now, but also this one, it's been really a game changer when it comes to policy. So there are a lot of things that before we had even, I mean, we would never dare to even talk about, now have become almost mainstream. There are a lot of issues that we could get into here that show to what extent really I think there's been a dramatic change. So this is a positive feature despite the hell that we have all gone through here, and that has really, as I said, has been a disaster at various levels, not only in terms of GDP here, but real lives that have been lost and so on. But at the same time, I do believe that this has led to some important changes that I don't know if it's of the magnitude as we saw after the Second World War, but it can well be that if indeed there is, if we're able to push it forward. And we're just, our two issues, I hope here, are just two drops here into this, pushing it forward in a direction that I hope will, really be, be taken more seriously, as I believe to some extent that is happening in some circles. Not, big changes, but there have been changes. They're incremental, but are important ones. Anyways, I'd like to thank everybody. I'm not sure if Louis Philippe, you want to say anything else, but thank you for, for having, taken the time. Thanks to the speakers and thanks to everybody who has been able to stay on until the end here. Okay. Thank you so much and have a good remaining day or evening or night. I'm not sure where you are.
Just one comment. No one has talked about Ricardo's beard.
Yes,
I
wanted to mention
just
that.
putting it
Well,
out there.
I noticed it. In the
I
first
noticed
moment,
it from the beginning.
I thought, what is it? Is it
That's
Ricardo?
COVID has,
It's retirement here.
COVID has been a face changer for me.
In his heterodox thinkers, we shouldn't be talking about scarcity, so.
That is one of the changes that have occurred.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Anyways, take care. Nice
Bye.
to see you all. Great to see you. Take care.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.